This video is based on real events and contains discussions of violence, crime, and other disturbing subject matter. Some viewers may find the content upsetting. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
Birth in 2 weeks' time. She was expecting a baby girl. But in the early hours of Saturday morning, her body was found here in the bedroom of her burning first-floor flat. A post-mortem examination showed she'd been stabbed twice. Police say they're keeping an open mind about whether she may have been sexually assaulted before she was murdered. Detectives are now working on the basis that Nikitta may have known her killer and that the fire was started deliberately to try to cover their tracks.
The fire was already burning when Carl Whant pulled up to Broadmead Park. He got out of his car. He walked over to where the neighbors had gathered in the cold. He found his 17-year-old cousin, Ryan Mays, and he stood beside him. And he watched. He had driven Ryan here himself. What Ryan didn't know, what nobody standing on that street at 5:30 in the morning had any reason to suspect, is that Carl Whant wasn't there to help. He was there to watch. Inside that first-floor flat, firefighters were working through smoke and flames, and what they were about to find would stop them in their tracks. Nikitta Grender, 19 years old, Ryan's girlfriend, 8.5 months pregnant, 2 weeks from her due date. She hadn't died in that fire. She had been murdered before it was even started. The fire was set deliberately to destroy what had been done to her, to burn away the evidence, to make sure no one ever found out. Carl Whant had been inside that flat less than an hour before the emergency services arrived. He had set the fire, then he walked out, got back in his car, drove to the party where Ryan was waiting, acted like nothing had happened, and brought his cousin here, to this street, to watch the building burn. He stood next to Ryan Mays in the cold, said nothing, showed nothing. The man standing beside Ryan that morning was the same man who had just murdered them both. What you're about to hear is a true story. Nikitta Grender was a real person. Kelsey-May was a real child who never got the chance to be born. The family left behind is real, and the pain they carry is real. This case involves extreme violence against a pregnant woman and her unborn daughter. Some of what you are about to hear is deeply disturbing. Some of it will be difficult to sit with. If you need to step away at any point, do. For those staying, this is the story of a 19-year-old girl who deserved so much more than what happened to her on the 5th of February, 2011. Her name was Nikitta Grender, and this is what was done to her. Newport, South Wales is a city built on steel and community, place where the same families have lived on the same streets for generations, where cousins grew up together, went to the same schools, worked the same jobs, where your neighbors knew your name, knew your business, knew your children. February 2011, and on the Liswerry estate, on a street called Broadmead Park. That's exactly how life worked. It wasn't a wealthy area. Nobody would pretend of otherwise. Rough around the edges in the way that many working-class estates are. But it was a community in the truest sense of the word.
I think they've had to stand up and tell the police to pull to him. Because otherwise it's going to be a case of vengeance.
I hope whoever's done this, they catch this person, because whoever's done this, I've seen some bad things happen. The friends I've lost over the years with this is the worst I've ever seen in my life. It's really, it's really got to me, man. It's very upsetting,
Yeah.
I've had tears in my eyes and everything, it's not fair.
People looked out for one another. Kids played out. Doors didn't always need to be locked, because everyone knew who belonged and who didn't. That familiarity was everything. It was the reason Ryan Mays trusted Carl Whant without question. Why Nikitta Grender let him into her life. Why nobody on that estate had any reason to look at this man and feel afraid. He was family. He was one of their own. And that's exactly what he used against them. Because the terrible truth that this case would force an entire community to confront, the truth that nobody on Broadmead Park was prepared for, is that sometimes the danger doesn't come from outside. Sometimes it doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it comes wearing the most familiar face you know, and it was already inside. Nikitta Jade Grender was born in March 1901 in Newport, South Wales. She grew up on the Ringland estate with her mother Marcia and her brother Luke before the family later moved to Liswerry. Her stepfather, Paul Brunnock, helped raise her. By all accounts, it was a loving home, a working-class family doing what working-class families do, getting on with it, looking after each other, making things work. And into that home came Nikitta. People who knew her struggled to put her into words, not because there wasn't enough to say, but because the words never quite felt like enough. Beautiful, yes, but that's not what they led with. What they led with was her spirit, the energy she carried, the way she could walk into a room and instantly shift the atmosphere just by being in it. She had a laugh that was impossible to resist, infectious, the kind that made you laugh before you even knew what was funny. She was warm in the way that some people just are, naturally, effortlessly, the kind of warm that made people feel seen, feel valued, feel like they mattered. Her family called her Keat. Friends couldn't forget her once they'd met her. Strangers became friends quickly, because that's just what happened when Nikitta turned her attention toward you. She had this magnetism about her that you couldn't manufacture. It was just who she was. She was 13 years old when she met Ryan Mays. 13, the age when most romances begin and end within a few weeks. The age when feelings are real, but the world doesn't take them seriously yet. But Nikitta and Ryan were different. They held on. Through all the chaos of growing up, through every argument and change and challenge that comes with navigating teenage years, they stayed together. By 2011, they had been a couple for 6 years. And by 2011, Ryan Mays had asked Nikitta Grender to marry him. She had said yes. She had dreams, fashion, beauty, something that suited the way she moved through the world. Her mother, Marcia, could picture it clearly. She said later she knew exactly what Nikitta's future was going to look like. A job she loved, something in a shop, maybe. Fashion or beauty. Somewhere her personality could fill the room the way it always did. A couple of kids, a good life, an ordinary, full, happy life. And now, at 19 years old, that life was right on the edge of beginning. The flat on Broadmead Park was theirs, hers and Ryan's. And inside that flat, one room had been transformed. A nursery, a crib standing ready in the corner, tiny clothes folded neatly in drawers, small enough to hold in one hand. Everything washed, everything waiting. A dog named Missy, who was going to have to learn to share the space with someone new. They had already chosen her name, Kelsey-May. Two names that felt like a whole future in themselves. February 21st, 2011 was circled on the calendar. The due date, 2 weeks away. 14 days from the moment that Nikitta and Ryan would stop being just a couple and become a family. The day Nikitta would hold her daughter for the first time. She never got there. She never got to be 20. And the world lost something it didn't even know it needed. A young woman with a laugh you couldn't resist, and a whole life ahead of her that was taken before it had the chance to happen. Ryan Mays was 17 years old. 17, still a teenager himself, still figuring out who he was. And yet here he was, engaged to the girl he'd loved since he was 13, a daughter 2 weeks away from coming into the world, and a flat on Broadmead Park that the two of them had turned into a home. He was trying to do things right. He had a job, working as a double-glazing salesman, earning money, contributing, doing what a young man does when he decides that the life in front of him matters and he's going to step up and meet it. He wasn't waiting for someone to hand him anything. He was 17 years old, and he was showing up. He went to work every day alongside his second cousin, Carl Whant. That detail matters. Remember it. But on the 4th of February, 2011, Ryan wasn't thinking about work. He was home with Nikitta, their flat, their nursery, Kelsey-May's clothes folded in the drawers, the crib standing ready, Missy wandering between the rooms. The two of them talking about the days ahead the way young couples do when their whole world is right on the edge of changing. Nervous, excited, Overwhelmed in that particular way that comes with knowing something enormous is coming and knowing you can't quite prepare for it. No matter how hard you try, it was ordinary, it was perfect. Nobody who loved them had any idea that this was the last ordinary day they were ever going to have. Carl Whant was 27 years old, Ryan's second cousin. But the word cousin doesn't quite capture it. These two had grown up together, gone out together, worked the same job together. Easy Carl was the older one, the one who'd been around, who'd seen more, who knew how things worked. To Ryan, he wasn't just family. He was his closest friend, from Bedou's Newport, a former nightclub bouncer, built for that job, a big presence, the kind of man who filled a room without trying, the kind of man who looked like someone you wanted on your side and not against you, on the surface. But Nikitta didn't see what Ryan saw. She had been watching Carl Whant for a while, and she didn't like what she saw. The way he carried himself around Ryan, the things he said, the lifestyle he led, the energy he brought with him every time he walked through their door. She didn't trust him. She told Ryan as much. Carl Whant was a heavy cocaine user. Drugs weren't occasional for him. They were woven into his life, into his nights out, into the version of himself he presented to the world. Nikitta could see exactly what that meant for Ryan. She was 19 years old, 2 weeks from having their daughter, trying to build something real. And here was this man, right at the center of Ryan's life, pulling in the exact opposite direction. Her instincts were right. She just didn't know how right. Because beneath everything Carl Whant showed the world, something was rotting. He had developed an obsession with Nikitta, not the protective concern of a cousin watching out for family. Something else entirely. Something that had no place in any healthy mind. This young woman, pregnant, glowing, building a future with someone he called his best friend, occupied his thoughts in ways that were deeply, profoundly disturbing. It would later emerge during the investigation that Whant told police Nikitta was the first person he thought of when he wanted sex. His own cousin's fiancé, 8.5 months pregnant. And here is perhaps the detail that reveals the most about who Carl Whant really was.
Fire, which was started after she was killed. And I have no doubt in my mind that it was started in order to disguise the attack and what had happened.
After the murder, after the fire, after he had watched Ryan discover what he had done, Carl Whant went to the Grender family home and brought flowers for the grieving family. He stood at their door with flowers in his hands. The judge who would later sentence him called him calculating, vain, and devious. He said the crimes came, in part, from Whant's vanity. He was right, but those words still don't quite reach it. February 4th, 2011. A Thursday, an ordinary day in an ordinary week, in what should have been the most joyful period of Nikitta and Ryan's young lives. 17 days from the due date. The flat on Broadmead Park was ready. Everything was in place. Everything was waiting. They spent that day the way couples do when the whole world is 2 weeks from changing. Talking about the future, running through the things they still needed to do, circling around the particular kind of nervousness that comes when you're standing right on the edge of something enormous and you can't quite see over it yet. It was the best kind of anxiety, the kind that comes with knowing your whole life is about to begin. That evening, Ryan went out. It wasn't unusual. He and Carl Whant went out regularly. That was just how it was between them. A night out, a few drinks, the kind of evening that came and went without leaving a mark. Nikitta stayed home, 8.5 months pregnant, settled in the flat, Missy keeping her company. February 21st still circled on the calendar. Still coming, still close, she had no reason to worry. At the party, drinks were flowing. Cocaine was being passed around. Carl Whant was drinking heavily, not casually, not socially, but the way he always drank when he was on a night out, the kind of drinking that strips away whatever thin layer of restraint a person carries. The drugs were doing the same work. Every hour that passed, the version of Carl Whant that had managed to hold things together was getting harder to Reinhardt is there beside him, completely unaware of what was building in the man next to him. Because at some point in those dark early hours of February 5th, somewhere between the drinks and the drugs and the noise of the party, Carl Whant made a decision. He knew Ryan wasn't going anywhere. He knew exactly where Nikitta was. He knew she would be awake or asleep or somewhere in between in the flat on Broadmead Park. He knew she would be alone. Nikitta would be alone. At around 4:30 in the morning, Carl Whant left the party. He told people he was going to get cigarettes. He got in his car, drunk, high on cocaine, and he drove to Broadmead Park. He had a knife with him. He knew Ryan was still at the party. He knew Nikitta was home alone. The judge who would later sentence him said Whant went to that flat with the intention of raping her. This was not a decision made in a single drunken moment. He left the party. He got in his car. He drove there. He brought a knife. He knocked on the door of the flat where Ryan May's pregnant fiancé was asleep, and Nikitta let him in. Because he was family. What happened inside that flat in the early hours of February 5th, 2011, is among the most brutal things you can ask a person to hear. Carl Whant raped Nikitta Grender. He stabbed her in the neck, cutting through the carotid artery. He stabbed her in the abdomen, wounds that drove through to Kelsey-May. But here is what you need to know about Nikitta Grender. She fought him, 8.5 months pregnant, against a man built to intimidate, armed with a knife. She fought him. She scratched at him with such force that forensic scientists would later find Carl Whant's DNA embedded beneath her fingernails. Scratch marks covered his arms. Nikitta's mother, Marcia, would later tell the court that scratching was how her daughter had always defended herself. Even then, even in those final moments, she did not surrender. She fought for herself. She fought for Kelsey-May. Carl Whant was stronger, and he had a knife, and he was determined. When it was over, he made another decision. He needed to remove the evidence. He needed this to look like an accident. He set fire to Nikitta's bed, with her body still on it, not one fire. Firefighters would later determine he had set 3 separate fires on the bed. 3. He wanted to make sure Missy was still in the flat. She had nowhere to go. She died in that fire. Then Carl Whant walked out of the burning flat, got into his car, and drove back to the party in Corelli Street. Back to the drinks, back to the noise, back to Ryan. He sat back down. He said nothing. He showed nothing. He acted, by all accounts, like a man who had been out to get cigarettes and come back empty-handed. And then, when the calls started coming in, when the news began filtering through that something had happened at Broadmead Park, that there was a fire, that Nikitta, he was right there, present, concerned, the devoted cousin. He offered to drive Ryan to the scene. And so, it was Carl Whant who pulled up to Broadmead Park that morning. Carl Whant who got out of the car alongside Ryan Mays. Carl Whant who stood in the cold with his arms length from a 17-year-old boy as the firefighters worked, and the smoke rose, and Ryan scanned those windows in terror, looking for the girl he was supposed to marry. He stood there, he watched, and he said nothing. At 5:30 in the morning of February 5th, 2011, a neighbor heard the smoke alarm. They looked up at the first-floor flat. Flames were already visible through the bedroom window. They dialed 999. Emergency services arrived at Broadmead Park within minutes. Firefighters pushed their way into the flat, through thick, acrid smoke, working through rooms that were already filling with heat and darkness. What they found in the bedroom would not leave them. On the charred remains of the bed was the body of a young woman, burned, unrecognizable. The initial assumption was what it always is in these situations: a tragic accident, a house fire in the early hours, a devastating but not uncommon thing. But something was wrong. The way the fire had started, the points where it had burned hottest, most deliberately. Investigators would later determine that 3 separate fires had been on that bed. The pattern wasn't accidental. The pattern was intentional. And beneath the destruction, there was something else waiting to be found. At 7:50 in the morning, Marcia Grender's phone rang. Every parent knows there are certain calls that change everything before you've said a word. The hour alone tells you something is wrong. The voice tells you something is worse. All Marcia was told was that there had been a fire at Nikitta's flat, that her daughter was inside. She and Paul Brunnock drove to Broadmead Park. They told themselves it wasn't as bad as it felt. They told themselves there would be something to hold on to when they got there. There wasn't. Nikitta was dead. There was no rescue to speak of, no last-minute save, no moment where it turned out to be less than the worst. Their daughter was gone. Their granddaughter, Kelsey-May, the baby they had never held, never met, never even seen outside of a scan, was gone. Gone before she ever drew a single breath outside her mother's body, and Missy was gone. The post-mortem examination delivered the final truth. Nikitta hadn't died in the fire. She had been dead before it was started. She had been murdered, and the fire had been set deliberately afterwards, to destroy what had been done to her, to burn away the evidence, to erase her. It had worked in the most devastating way possible. The fire had consumed so much of Nikitta's body that her parents would never be able to see her face again. That last goodbye, the thing every family is owed when they lose someone, was taken from them too. For Marcia and Paul, seeing their granddaughter Kelsey-May for the very first time would be in a mortuary. That is what Carl Whant did to this family. What had started as a fire investigation was now something else entirely. Gwent police launched a murder inquiry, and they had a name in their minds almost from the moment the post-mortem results came through. Carl Whant had spent the night with Ryan. He had been at the party. He had been one of the last people to leave Broadmead Park that morning. He knew Nikitta was home. He knew Ryan wasn't there. The pieces were visible from the start. But suspicion isn't evidence. And in a case where the killer had deliberately set fire to the crime scene, had burned the bed, burned the room, burned the body, building a case was going to require forensic work of the highest order. That's exactly what Gwent police delivered. Forensic teams moved through what remained of the flat at Broadmead Park, inch by inch, through the smoke damage and the ash and the deliberate destruction that Carl Whant had tried to leave behind. And what they found, piece by piece, was that the fire hadn't worked, not the way it needed. DNA evidence recovered from the crime scene placed Carl Whant inside that flat, not as Ryan's cousin who'd popped round, but in a way that told investigators exactly what had happened there. Nikitta had fought him. She had scratched at him until she had his DNA embedded beneath her fingernails. That evidence survived the fire. It survived everything he had tried to do. Then there was the blood on a shirt belonging to Carl Whant in his car. Forensic analysis confirmed it as Nikitta's blood. He had driven away from Broadmead Park with the evidence of what he had done sitting in the car alongside him. And then there were the cameras. 3 separate CCTV cameras had captured Carl Whant's car in the early hours of February 5th. 3 independent systems at 3 separate points, each one time-stamped, each one showing the same vehicle, his vehicle, making its way from the area of the party in Corelli Street toward Broadmead Park. 3 cameras that together built an overlapping, unbroken, irrefutable record of his movements on the night Nikitta died. When confronted with this, Whant had an explanation. He claimed he had been driving in that direction to pick up cigarettes from his grandmother's house in the early hours of the morning, while drunk and on cocaine, while his pregnant cousin's fiancé lay dead in a burning flat less than a mile away. The jury would later reject that explanation without hesitation. Police searched extensively for the murder weapon. They drained drains. They combed gardens and surrounding streets. They looked everywhere a knife might have been thrown, or buried, or discarded. It was never found. Carl Whant had disposed of it, and it has never been recovered. It didn't matter, because what Gwent police had built, evidence by evidence, camera by camera, was a case that closed every door Carl Whant might have tried to walk through. His DNA at the scene, Nikitta's blood on his clothing and in his car. 3 cameras that placed him exactly where he had no innocent explanation for being, and the knowledge that he had gone to that flat with a knife at a time when he knew Nikitta would be alone. The judge would later say it plainly. In Corelli Street, Whant had decided to go to her flat. He knew she was unlikely to agree to sex, so he went armed with a knife, prepared to rape her. Carl Whant was arrested. Carl Whant was arrested, and then Gwent police sat across from him, and they asked him to explain himself. They asked about the DNA. They asked about the blood on his shirt and in his car. They asked about the CCTV footage that placed him on the route to Broadmead Park in the early hours of February 5th. They asked him to account for his movements. They asked him to tell them what had happened to Nikitta Grender. They asked him to tell them why. They asked him 26 times, 26 separate police interviews, 26 opportunities to offer an explanation, to dispute the evidence, to say anything at all that might account for what the forensics were showing. 26 times investigators sat in that room and put the case to Carl Whant, piece by piece, and waited for a response. 26 times, he said nothing. Not a denial. Not an alternative version of events. Not a single word of explanation for why a 19-year-old girl was dead in a burnt-out flat with his DNA on her body and her blood in his car. Complete silence. There are people who stay silent because they are frightened, or confused, or advised to by legal counsel. And then there are people who stay silent because they know exactly what the evidence shows, and they have nothing that can explain it away. Carl Whant knew what he had done. He knew what the investigators had found, and he said nothing. Behind closed doors, Gwent police kept building, evidence by evidence, interview by interview. They were constructing a case that was becoming impossible to dismantle. And Carl Whant stayed silent all the way through it. 26 interviews, 26 rounds of silence. And then, in December 2011, months after his arrest, months after Gwent police had laid out the evidence against him, piece by piece, Carl Whant's defense team issued a statement. For the first time, he had something to say. It was not a confession. It was not remorse. It was not an explanation that showed even a fragment of humanity for what had happened to Nikitta and Kelsey-May. It was something far worse than silence. Whant claimed that his DNA was present at the scene because he had had consensual sex with Nikitta Grender that night. And then he went further. He claimed that Ryan had invited him into the bedroom, that both of them had been with Nikitta together, that his DNA, his presence, his connection to the crime scene, all of it had an innocent explanation. And that explanation was that Nikitta had agreed to it. He called the scratch marks on his arms. The marks that forensic scientists confirmed came from Nikitta's fingernails as she fought desperately for her life and her babies, the result of consensual activity. This claim had never appeared, not once, not in any of those 26 interviews. Not a single word of it had been offered to the investigators who had sat across from him and asked him again and again to account for himself. It arrived months later, fully formed, constructed precisely to introduce reasonable doubt once he had seen the weight of the forensic evidence against him, a lie built on the body of a murdered girl, designed to make a jury question what they knew. And it meant that Ryan Mays, who had already lost everything, his fiancé, his daughter, his cousin, his best friend, all in a single night, was going to have to walk into a courtroom and face one final unbearable insult. When prosecutors put Whant's claim to Ryan during the trial, his answer came without hesitation. Nothing like that happened. He's a liar. I'd never do that, especially not with my cousin. 5 sentences. From a young man who had already endured more than most people will face in a lifetime. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to the person who had destroyed his family construct a lie so vile it used Nikitta's own name to tell it. Ryan Mays was 17 years old when Nikitta died. He was still just 18 when he had to sit in Newport Crown Court and listen to this. The trial at Newport Crown Court lasted more than a month. More than 70 friends and family members of Nikitta's came every day. They filled the public gallery beyond its comfortable capacity. They sat through every piece of evidence, every witness, every moment of a trial that required them to hear, in clinical detail, exactly what had been done to the girl they loved. During the early stages, there had been angry scenes outside the court as Whant was driven away in a custody van. The community had not forgotten. It had not moved on. Prosecution QC Greg Taylor set out the case with precision. The DNA, the blood in the car, the 3 cameras, the scratch marks, the deliberate pattern of the 3 fires set on that bed. A case built to be impossible to walk away from. And through all of it, through every day, every detail, every lie told by Whant's defense team in that room, Marcia Grender and Paul Brunnock sat composed. They did not break. Marcia would later say she had made a decision from the moment she walked in. She was not going to let Carl Whant see her upset. She wanted him to look her in the eyes. He had taken her daughter. He would not take her dignity. The jury was sent to deliberate on February 21st, 2012. February 21st, the day Kelsey-May was supposed to be born, the day that 1 year earlier had been circled on the calendar in the flat on Broadmead Park. She should have been turning 1 year old. Nikitta should have been there, watching her daughter take her first steps, hearing her first words. Instead, her family sat in a courtroom and waited. The next morning, February 22nd, the jury returned, guilty of murder, guilty of rape, guilty of arson, guilty of child destruction under the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929. 4 unanimous verdicts. The word guilty, spoken 4 times in that courtroom. Each time it came, an audible sigh moved through the public gallery. More than 70 people who had sat through weeks of evidence, through every terrible detail, through every lie, finally hearing what they had come for. Tears, embraces, relief that justice at least had been done. Ryan Mays looked at Carl Whant at each verdict and shook his head. Carl Whant stared straight ahead, still expressionless. He would later appear to yawn. Before he passed sentence, Judge Mr. Justice Griffith Williams paused to thank the public gallery for its restraint throughout the trial. 70 people who had every reason to break had held themselves together through weeks of unimaginable testimony. Then he turned to Carl Whant. He described him as calculating, vain, and devious. He said the explanation for what he had done lay in part in his own vanity. He noted that Whant had expressed no remorse, not a word of it, not once, and that in an act of extraordinary hypocrisy, he had taken flowers to the Grender family after the murder, stood at the door of the people whose daughter he had killed, and offered them condolences. The normal minimum starting point for a murder such as this would have been 30 years, but there were aggravating factors that placed this beyond normal. Whant had not only murdered Nikitta, he had destroyed the life of Kelsey-May inside her. And by setting fire to that bed, with her body still on it, he had burned away so much of Nikitta that her parents and Ryan Mays were denied even the chance to see her face one last time. Carl Whant was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years. And then there was Kelsey-May. The Crown Prosecution Service had made a deliberate decision to pursue a separate charge of child destruction specifically for her under the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929. The CPS argued that given how advanced the pregnancy was, Kelsey-May was unambiguously a child capable of being born alive, and that she deserved recognition under the law in her own right. The jury agreed. The conviction that followed was the first ever for child destruction in Welsh legal history. Kelsey-May Mays, the baby who never drew a breath, was named in a courtroom. She was counted. She was not forgotten. Outside Newport Crown Court, the family gathered on the steps. Someone said simply, "Job done." No sentence handed down in that courtroom was going to be enough. 35 years, 50 years, a lifetime. None of it brings Nikitta back. None of it gives Marcia and Paul their granddaughter. None of it gives Ryan his fiancé or his daughter. The verdict was right. The sentence was right. and it changed nothing about the shape of the hole that had been left in all of their lives. They went home and tried to continue. Marcia Grender went back to her job as a teaching assistant. Paul Brunnock went back to driving his van. They tried to build something around the absence, to fill the days and the hours and the mornings that kept arriving whether they wanted them to or not. The pain didn't fade. It became something they carried, something that was simply always there, woven into everything. For years, the flat on Broadmead Park stood empty, boarded up, a ghost of a building at the end of the street. In 2015, 4 years after the murder, it was finally demolished, at the request of Nikitta's family and Ryan. New houses were built on that spot. New families moved in, families who didn't know. But for the people who had loved Nikitta, the ground itself still held the memory. Marcia began writing it all down, a diary first, a private place to put the grief and the memories and the thoughts she couldn't speak out loud. In 2016, she published it as a book, Nikitta, A Mother's Story. She wanted people to understand who her daughter really was. Not a headline, not a case number. A girl who lit up every room she walked into, a mother-to-be with names picked out and clothes folded, and a future she never got to live. And she wanted Carl Whant's name said, out loud, repeatedly. Not because she wanted to think about him, she refuses to give him that power, but because if he ever walks out of a prison door, people should know exactly who he is and what he is capable of. In the garden of Newport East Community Center, there is a memorial, a yellow rose, Nikitta's favorite. Every year on the 5th of February, Marcia and Paul release yellow balloons into the sky above Newport. Messages come in from friends, from strangers, from people who never knew Nikitta, but who have come to know her through what was done to her, and through everything her mother has done to make sure she isn't forgotten. Nikitta Grender was 19 years old. She had a laugh you couldn't resist and a light that people still talk about years after she's gone. She had a name picked out for her daughter, a crib standing in the corner, and February 21st circled on the calendar. She never got there, but her name is still being said. Nikitta. Kelsey-May, say them, don't let them be forgotten. Nikitta Grender was 19 years old. She had a laugh that nobody who heard it ever forgot. She walked into rooms and changed them. She made strangers feel like friends. She had yellow roses as her favorite flower, a dog called Missy, a name picked out for her daughter, and a crib standing ready in the corner of a nursery she would never use. She was 2 weeks from the most important day of her life. She had the whole thing ahead of her. Kelsey-May never drew a single breath outside of her mother's body. She never opened her eyes. She never heard her name spoken in the flat on Broadmead Park, where she was supposed to come home to. But because of the determination of Gwent police, and because the Crown Prosecution Service made the decision to pursue a separate charge in her name, and because a jury said the word guilty 4 times in a courtroom in Newport, the law recognizes that she existed, that she was real, that she was taken, that what was done to her matters. No clear motive for what Carl Whant did has ever emerged. He has never explained it. He has never shown remorse. He simply took them and said, but Marcia Grender is still saying something. Every February 5th, every year, it is a date we're never going to forget, she said. It's a day Nikitta and Kelsey-May will always be remembered. A day we can show our girls they're loved and they'll never be forgotten. Say their names. Nikitta, Kelsey-May, thank you for watching. If this video sent something to you, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. It genuinely helps more people find this content and find these stories. Sources for everything covered in this documentary are listed in the description, including Marcia Grender's book, Nikitta, A Mother's Story, which you can find through the link below. If there is a case you'd like to see covered on this channel, tell us in the comments. We read everyone. Nikitta and Kelsey-May, not forgotten.